So I was just rewatched the Oppenheimer movie, a great movie, and I love its depiction of power games. So Oppenheimer was absolute genius, but may have thought he was smarter than he really was at his ability to navigate what's socially acceptable, because what's socially acceptable changes depending on the situation. So prior to 1945, we were allies with the Soviet Union, and so having communist ties is not as damaging prior to 1945 as it became during the Cold War. So J. Robert Oppenheimer carried on an affair with a communist woman. He had many friends who were communists, including communists who took care of his children. And he had great confidence in his ability to navigate these subversive ties. And when the United States needed him, he was able to get away with having a lot of communist ties. But after 1945, he tried to use his pulpit as the most famous man in the world to push for international agreements with regard to nuclear weapons. And there's nothing about being a scientist that conveys wisdom in international relations. So by speaking out for international peace deals to limit the development of nuclear weapons, right, he got out of his area of expertise. He alienated himself from the powers that be, and even some of his closest allies and friends, right, turned against him, and they're able to create an operation to take away his military clearance. And they created a situation that he could not win. And something that I noticed in myself and in a lot of other intellectuals, they have much greater confidence than is warranted at their ability to navigate changing norms. Right? It's a very dangerous situation to operate on the edges of society. Right? When you look at the herd, the safest place for you to be is in the middle of the herd. Right? If you're on the margins of the herd, right, you're much more likely to get picked off by the predators. And Oppenheimer operated on the margins of polite society, had an exaggerated sense of his own ability to detect what was socially acceptable and what was not. And he had an exaggerated sense of his own profundity and wisdom in speaking out for unilateral nuclear disarmament. And there's absolutely nothing in creating a nuclear weapon that then gives you wisdom with regard to the military and political use of nuclear weapons. And so a lot of scientists had this same problem, right? They had an exaggerated sense of their own importance. I mean, it's almost a universal problem. It's just one of the inevitable stages of life, that you're going to have an exaggerated sense of your own competence and importance. Like employees have it all the time, thinking that they're irreplaceable. And then they become haughty, and they become just too much trouble to work with, and they get fired. And I'm continuing on in my David Stahel book on the Panzer generals of Germany during World War II, and how they and their spouses would try to survive after losing the war and tried to avoid execution. And the book is stinging in its rebuke of their criminal ways. But I don't think that American soldiers lost a lot of sleep over the number of dead Iraqis from US sanctions or from US bombings of Iraqi electrical facilities. There are various reports that sanctions led by the United States against Iraq cost hundreds of thousands of lives of Iraqi children. I have no idea if that's true. There's controversy over various reports, but there's no discernible difference between the way that liberal democracies wage war and the way that more authoritarian regimes wage war. And it's not as though liberal democracies are much more kind But with regard to civilians, in fact, there's even evidence that they're less kind, because liberal democracies fight war not primarily on a pragmatic basis, but on a basis of invocations that the enemy is evil. So it's not just that the enemy threatens one's survival, it's that he represents a force of evil. And so that transforms a war for survival into a grand ideological war. And I would not expect any side in a brutal conflict such as Germany versus the Soviet Union in World War II to spare a great deal of thought for the well-being of the enemy. The more intense the conflict, the more ethnocentric, one-sided, nationalistic people get. Oh, the other thing that struck me from the Oppenheimer movie is that Oppenheimer, he became the most famous man in the world, but as soon as the United States had nuclear weapons, he no longer had importance to the American efforts. And so I know from my times as a journalist, when I'm dominating a beat and I have an important role, right, people are very careful in their dealings with me, but then if I walk away, right, that ends, boom. So I'm sure you've experienced where you have substantial influence and power 1 minute, then you walk away from your role and it's all gone, and you're back to being treated as just another person. And if your sense of self is substantially invested in other people treating you with deference, right, that loss of power has to be devastating. But all these scientists who are being treated with great deference up until the discovery and successful test of the nuclear weapon, right, they lost that power. Right, they created the weapon and then it was transferred to the military, and their job was substantially done.